we go. So now, we're going to talk about moose. New
Yeah,
day, extended podcast rather than do a 2 hour one,
for sure.
which is fine. Like I've done long podcasts before, but sometimes it's nice to break it up and have two separate episodes. So, moose, talk to me about moose.
Yeah.
Actually, first of all,
So
maybe let's kind of go um, what the idea was. How much time did you take off? Like, what were you kind of looking at pregame there, and then we can get into kind of the story of it.
yeah. So going into this year, well, going back actually to last year, did a float hunt, had a cool opportunity. Pa ultimately passed on a bull because I just couldn't tell if he was legal or not. And my buddy Kyle and I did that on a float hunt. And I'd never done a float hunt before. I'd done some overnight float trips, but I was like, man, this is pretty cool. It's nice to be able to float from spot to spot, hunt along the way, kind of get away from people. And so, looking at this season, I wanted to do a pack rafting trip. I had the opportunity to purchase a couple pack rafts if I wanted to. The plan was to do that this summer, and my buddy had a bear bait station that was only accessible via solar, so like inflatable jet boat. And he had seen a lot of moose sign during the bear baiting season. So I was like, okay, well, I want to do a pack raft trip. I now possibly have a river. And so I was talking to my dad, and the plan for this season was to have my buddy take us up to where his bear bait was up in that drainage, drop us off with two pack rafts, and we were going to spend 7 to 10 days floating out. And that was kind of my plan for the summer.
What was
And
like how big are the pack rafts?
then they were the Pristine Ventures PR 49s.
Okay. So anybody who was like if sometimes the first pack raft that comes to mind is the alpaca, which you'd need a
Mhm.
couple of those barges, but I don't know. They might be able to take it, but ooh, that'd be a little rough. So yeah, those pristine ventures out of Fairbanks, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I mean, and those are designed for hauling out a whole moose and person and gear. Last year, we used one on our blacktail hunt in Prince William Sound, and we actually pulled one behind our like 8 foot little tender dinghy with like a 15 horse, and we had four bucks and almost all of our gear for three people on one of those, and we were dragging that behind, and it floated really well. So I was pretty impressed by it, and I was like, well, if it can handle that, I'm sure it can probably handle a person, a moose, and gear. So that was the plan going into summer. And then, as we talked on the last episode, purchased a house. So buying pack rafts was kind of out of the question. The budget was all towards the house. And so that didn't really work out. And then my buddy who had the boat, he had some work scheduling stuff. So he wouldn't have been able to take us up there anyway. So it all worked out that it didn't happen. But my dad was still going to come up, and as we said yesterday, he's working on the house. So I knew I had limited opportunity. And then going into the season, with the house, with guiding, having a really busy September, I didn't have a whole lot of time going into it. And so I wasn't really going to be able to take a bunch of time off and put in as much time as I really wish I had.
Mhm. So like when you're looking at for good spots, moose are obviously much different than like elks that have herds and they have their summer territory and their winter territory. Um, there's a migration corridor obviously for caribou too. So moose are just kind of where they're at. And I think I read
Mhm.
somewhere that their territory, not really a migration area, but their territory is 50 to 100 miles. So when you're looking at territory that's going to be good, you don't really have to worry about something necessarily migrating out of that area. And then also you have they're not herd animals in the same way that we think of elk and caribou. So they kind of clump up. There might be some groups, or it might be some intermingling of some of these areas, but not a herd mentality in the way that we think of elk and caribou. So when you're choosing these spots and you're looking at potential or good sign, you're looking at um, browse, you're looking at sign, you're looking at scrapes, you're looking at what are some of the indicators that you thought it was going to be a good area.
Yeah, I was looking, honestly, I was looking more at places that people weren't going to be able to go to. So there's a lot of places around here that folks will take Argos and side by sides and they'll take these trails and they'll bomb out,
That's your
five.
Alaska Wild project.
Exactly.
Then
Yeah.
that looks awesome. That looks like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it looks like a ton of fun. I mean, you're not having to physically haul the animals super far, but like listen to Chad's story last year and having Argo issues and side by side issues. And I've been there. That was what happened with my first moose, is we had a lot of Argo issues and that's fun. But that's one thing I've noticed about Alaska is a lot of folks will only go wherever they can get a side by side to. So I was looking for more places where like, okay, either non-motorized or places that are just a little bit further than they'd want to walk and pack out a moose. And so that's kind of what I was looking for. And then looking for kind of your transitional zones between like swamps and a birch forest where there's good browse, good cover, but they like to be kind of near that water. And then in the daytime, trying to like get back into cover, get somewhere where they can hide. And then, looking for edges of burns where you have an old growth birch forest, which is fairly open, they can move around. But then having those burns where now the canopy is opened up and they do have that newer browse and again, that thicker cover they can kind of hide in during the day.
Mhm. I've never been on a moose hunt, but just reading a lot about it, and then anytime that I'm in the interior Fairbanks area, just looking around and looking for moose and looking for sign and just kind of making the most of those opportunities so that when I do go on a moose hunt, it's not necessarily square one. There's a huge difference between reading about and actually doing. But doing some of that scouting, floating some of those rivers and looking for stuff and those edges and what was what was around when we happened to see the moose, and it kind of you stockpile those sort of memories and those sort of ideas to kind of get you helped out for the future.
Yeah, yeah, and I do that a lot too, floating on the local creeks around here when I'm guiding. If I see like say a moose trail coming down into the creek, I might walk up and be like, all right. So I walk out of the creek and I'm looking and I'm thinking of this one particular time this season I walked up and it's this big flat. There's a ton of sign coming down to the river. It's a big flat with a bunch of big birch. And then maybe, I don't know, a quarter mile away, there's a fairly tall ridge line where a critter could get up there and look around or listen to calls. It's fairly flat, it's fairly thick. There's really good browse. They have water at the creek, and then they could just cover territory if they wanted to. So again, it's that kind of that transition between some older stuff. They got a thicker canopy. There's some big open flats. There's a ridge line, just a little bit of varying terrain. And then there's a few like big sloughs and swamps within that little area. So just trying to find a variety of terrain
Hmm.
features.
And you can't really most of the registration and the over-the-counter harvest ticket are spike fork, 50-inch or three brow tines. So if you're
Mhm.
not really getting eyes on the moose themselves, is there part of you that thinks, man, it looks like there's a lot of sign, but what if this is just, a medium-sized moose, or there's going to be nothing legal here, and so I'm putting all my eggs in this basket, but there might not be one that's legal shooting? Or is that just part of the territory with moose hunting? Same thing with sheep, you go up top and, well, it just didn't happen, and I chose my drainage and I did that, and that's just how the things fell.
Yeah, it's just part of the territory. I think it's you never know what you're going to call in or what you're going to see. It could be, a 75-inch ginormous bull, or it could be a 30-inch bull with three brow tines. Yeah, you never know what's gonna come in. There are a few things, I being able to determine cow versus bull tracks, so you can know, okay, yeah, there is a bull in this area, or maybe you have a cow and a calf, and so you're seeing a big set of tracks and a little set of tracks. And then looking at rubs, I saw some rubs that were really small, and then I saw one set of rubs on a fairly thick spruce tree. It might have been 4 to 6 inches around, and this rub was all on one side of the tree, and it spanned like 3 feet up and down the trunk. So I'm like, all right, I don't think a little bull is going to make that big of a rub. That must have been a decent sized rack that made that. So looking for those kind of things, and then ultimately what led to having some success this season was finding the cows and then sitting on the cows and waiting for them to go into estrus and the bulls. And they're essentially just like a live decoy and having them bring the bulls in.
Mhm. Well, let's start there. So you head off on the hunt. How many days did you have? What did you pack? Who went with you? What was the setup?
Yeah, so I pretty much just had evenings after guiding to hunt. So I would get off the river about, between 4:30, get back home a little after 5, and then eat dinner and try to be out in the woods from between 6 and 7, and then sit until dark. So I had pretty much by the time I started doing that, I had like 2 weeks left of season. Whenever the season starts, I'm like, all right, August 25th, I have until September 25th. And then 5 days will go by. I'm like, all right, I have this many days left. And then, okay, I have 20 days left. All right, I got 15 days left. And kind of once I hit that 15-day mark, I'm like, I have to be out there. I have to make something happen if it's going to happen. And that usually that last 2 weeks of season are when those bulls really go into the rut. Less daylight, things are starting to get cool, leaves are starting to fall, and those bulls are going to start moving looking for cows. So that's really what I was like, putting all of my eggs into that one basket. Last couple weeks of season, one certain area, just put all the eggs in that basket and dedicate all my time towards that. So to start, I was spending like every other evening I was going out, staying out till dark, kind of walking areas and looking for sign, looking for critters. And this season was unique in that almost every time I went out, I either saw a moose or jumped a moose or saw a really fresh sign. So first night I did this huge like 4 mile walkabout and I jumped a cow and a calf and I got out way out to this point and that's where I got into some really fresh moose sign. I'm like, man, I'm a mile and a half from the road. I had to cross a beaver dam and a swamp and all these ridges. I'm like, this would be a terrible place to shoot a moose because it was non-motorized, so you'd have to walk all the way back there and get it. So kind of crossed that place off the map. And
And you go in waders. We talked a little bit yesterday about you using waders for these hunts. So you're in full on waders, which makes it tough because those boots are a little bit heavy. So just getting through all that muck by your just normally would be difficult. Adding on however many shuttles of moose would just be horrible, beyond
yeah.
horrible.
Well, so in this hunt, I wasn't actually wearing waders.
Okay.
I did have them in previous hunts. On my float hunts, I pretty much stayed in waders. But on this one, I was just in like I've got a taller pair of Crispies with gaiters. And then if I did end up shooting something in the swamp, I had waders in the truck. I would have gone back and put those on. So this year I pretty much just stayed in boots. Um, but after that, I went back to an area where I'd been hunting in the previous year and um, kind of started going back in there every other night. And one of the first nights I was back in there, I jumped a cow. And it's one of those areas where there's a ridge line. I'm right next to a fresh burn, so there's a lot of browse around, but there is, older growth, birch forest, so they have areas they can walk around, places they can bed. There's a swamp, there's a creek nearby, so they have water. So it's kind of everything they need within like this half a mile area. And so jumped that cow, sat on this ridge line where I've sat before, and just kind of put all these pieces together where I'm seeing a lot of fresh sign. There's a moose in here. If I just keep coming back to this spot, eventually that cow that I'm seeing is going to go into estrus. And she wasn't spooked really. My wife was with me. We jumped her at like 60 yards. She just kind of looked at us and eventually walked off. So I came back in a couple days later, saw more fresh sign, kept just going back into this spot over and over and over again. And then once we got into like the last 10 days of season, I was hitting it every single night. And again, I was either seeing that cow or I was jumping some kind of moose or smelling moose or seeing fresh sign. Once we kind of got into that last, week or so a season, week and a half, I was in there and I started seeing more rubs. That's when I saw that really big rub on the spruce tree. I was getting down to where I had been calling and I was just smelling moose. And those bulls, once they get ready, they get really stinky. It's kind of like an elk where they just get really ready. So I'm like, all right, I'm seeing rubs, I'm smelling moose. It's really getting later in the season. They're starting to get ready. One of the last trips I was in there, I had gotten to this knob where I'd been glassing, and I lit out one cow call, and I heard what I thought was a moose walking through the brush and antlers hitting the trees. And one thing I'd really been focusing on early in the season before the rut was not trying to do too many cow calls, because I think that's kind of that's what you see on TV. That's what people talk about is you just
Hmm.
walk around and you do these long drawn out cow calls. And
Which you're pretty
really,
good at. Didn't you get like second place at the Alaska Wild Project elk or moose calling contest?
I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I love doing it. It's really fun, but it's also like, when you're hunting elk, right, you're not bugling in August usually,
Yeah.
right? Like if sometimes you are, but most of the time, they're not really bugling until they're in the rut in the middle or into September. And so I'm not, it's the same thing with cow moose. I'm not going to let out a cow estrus call at the beginning of September. Maybe there's a moose in there that's going into estrus, but it's not really likely. And those bulls are like, oh, well, there's a cow over there, but I'm not really in the rut, so I'm not really interested. So doing some research, watching videos, listening to podcasts. A lot of people early in the season are just kind of letting out bull grunts, just soft grunts, maybe lightly raking trees, just rubbing their velvet off, just kind of starting to get a feel for things. And so that's what I was doing, walking around, lightly grunting, rubbing here and there, and then just trying to make moose sounds. Like I didn't want to just walk around really lightly and just try to sneak around because, animals can tell when you're sneaking around versus when you're just walking around. And so I was trying to sound like a moose. I was stepping on brush. I wasn't trying to sneak through the quietest possible way. I always carry a wooden canoe paddle because that, to me, that sounds the closest to a moose antler when you're raking. So I'd carry my canoe paddle, and every once in a while, walking through some brush, I would just hold that canoe paddle up and just drag it through the brush as I'm walking, just to make it sound like I'm a bull just walking through and grunting and walking. So as I'm getting later into the season, I'm doing a little bit less of that, and I'm starting to throw in a few cow calls here and there. And then as I'm getting into the last couple weeks, I'm starting to do some cow calls, and then I'm throwing in some grunting with the cow calls, throwing in some raking. So I'm trying to sound like a cow moose that's going into estrus, and then there's a bull right there with her. And with the mindset that a bull is going to hear that and be like, oh, well, there's a cow moose up there, and she must be in heat because there's another bull up there with her. So I get to my glassing knob, and I do kind of like this 30 or 40-yard circle where I would cow call, walk a few steps, bull grunt, rake, go back, cow call, and just sound like these moose are just kind of walking around in this area, drop down into the swamp, and just kind of sound like there's moose moving around. And I'm ramping that up as I'm getting to the end of season. Longer, more sexy, drawn out cow calls, more aggressive raking, and just really trying to pull something into that area. Again, knowing that that cow is there, I'm always seeing her, I'm always hearing her, and she's always in that zone. So we're just kind of treating her as a live decoy, and then really trying to get my sounds out as far as I can. Um,
Are you worried at some of these times, like with calling and with animals that you see and know that are around, if you're not super far back, if you're not on a fly out, then there's a chance that someone else could be around there. There's a chance that one of the things that we're concerned about around here, I'm around rut, is just how many people have been calling to these bucks. And
mhm.
so there are a couple times where I've just been quiet and I've heard someone just wailing on a call, and all of a sudden a buck is just sprinting in the opposite direction. It's like they've almost been conditioned to to override the instinct to go toward the call and instead run away because the last couple times if they didn't get shot, they encountered a human and not what they expected. So are you worried about that dynamic, or you just kind of stay focused on running this program?
Yeah, I was just kind of staying focused. I hadn't seen a whole lot of people. I'd seen a few trucks like pulled off in kind of the same general area, but I never really saw many people right where I was. So I wasn't too concerned about it. Um, but it was definitely in the back of my mind. Every evening driving there, I'm like super stressed and I'm like driving there as fast as I can. I'm like, oh, I hope somebody's not in my spot, and just trying to get there and just that relief, like, all right, nobody's here. I'm gonna hike in, I'm gonna go sit at my spot, do my thing, and not worry too much about it. So um yeah, so just kept running that program, and then last year it was the last Friday of season. Last year I think season closed on, it was on 25th, so it was like a Tuesday or something. And so this year the last Friday of season was the 20th, and I was like, all right, the last Friday last year, Kyle and I called in that bull right at dark, and I figured, it's about that same time of year, uh, something's probably going to happen. So my wife and I went in, did the same program we always did our same hike in, walked the same path, went to the same spot, sat down, hung out for a little bit. And I, again, thought I heard something down kind of past the swamp, down towards this creek. And I thought I could hear something walking, and I could just swear every once in a while I'd hear antlers tick in the brush. So I dropped down into the swamp, and I got into, there's the big swamp is in front of me. There was a tree line, maybe 100, 150 yards out. And then I had a bunch of like those shorter black spruce behind me. And then up on the ridge line, my wife was kind of sitting on top. And I got down there and I started letting out some cow calls. Could definitely tell it was a moose walking. And every once in a while, I'd hear a snort and just antlers tick in the brush, letting out cow calls. The moose started moving around a little bit more. And then I started doing a couple light grunts, and then started raking a little bit. And that really got that bull going, because as soon as I started raking, I started hearing raking back. And just really light. I was going really light, and that bull was going really light. And he started walking around and snorting a little bit more. And so I tried to cut the distance a little bit. I could tell this moose was probably 250 or so yards out. And I started getting closer and closer. And as I was getting closer and closer, I started ramping up. So I cow call, grunt, rake. And then he would do a walk around a little bit, snort, and start raking. And then we got to a point where I was raking a little bit harder than he was raking a little bit harder. I was cutting the distance, raking harder. He was cutting the distance, raking harder. And it got to the point where like I'd rake, 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 rake. And then as soon as I was done, he was raking. And I was raking and he was raking. And I was grunting and he was grunting. It was just really amping each other up. We got within about probably 100 yards of each other. I was on the very far end of the swamp, and I was sticking to spruce trees and trying to get up, um, either where I had like a log I could stand on, or there were tussocks down there in the swamp, and you'd be the top of a tussock would be 2 feet off the bottom of the swamp, and you get down, and I'd be standing in like ankle deep water, and I was like barely able to see over the grass. So I was trying to stay up as high as I could so I could see, and that bull could hear me walking in there. And I got to the point where I could hear him splashing around. When we know we're close to each other, I could just start smelling that bull kind of wafting around in there. And once I kind of broke into that 100 yard, 80 yard range, I he just kind of went quiet on me.
Hmm.
I tried to get higher up so I could see down into the swamp. And I don't know if maybe my wind switched or what happened, but all of a sudden that bull went quiet. I never heard him. I kind of heard some grunts far off, like he was walking away. So, that whole call-in session started about 7:45 or so, and it got dark about 9. So that whole thing lasted a little over an hour. Ultimately, I never saw the bull. I definitely got within 100 yards. My wife was able to hear the whole thing. That was awesome for her. Um, I walked back in the dark. She had actually had a lynx run right past her
Oh,
while I
wow.
was out doing that. There's a lot of like little meadow voles and stuff, and I've been seeing some lynx tracks in that area. And she said it was right before dark. She was sitting on the ridge, and just this gray shape just went flying right by her at like 30 feet. And I'm like, well, there's only one thing that could do that. It was definitely a link. So that was really cool for her to witness. That was cool to be down there, be that close to a bull, have that call-in session, raking, and then knowing last year when we called that bull in, it got too dark for us to tell if the bull was legal or not. Um, so this year, instead of being a little more passive and trying to bring the moose to me, I tried to be a little bit more aggressive and push out there and try to get close to that bull and make something happen. And in that instance, I don't know if maybe I pushed too hard, or again, if the
Hmm.
wind switched, what happened. But I was pretty happy with my decision to push forward like that. Um, and try to make it happen before dark and see if I could at least see the bull. And then like, ultimately having to back out. But again, knowing that if I didn't spook these moose too much, having that cow in the area, there's definitely a bull who's in the rut willing to play. If I come back in here tomorrow, I think I can make something happen.
Mhm. That's always a tough thing when you're not exactly sure what you did wrong. And it's hard to
Mm-hmm.
focus on everything you did right because you had a serious, legit encounter, but then it didn't work out. What
Mm-hmm.
was the problem? You land a dry fly perfectly, and a fish comes up and looks at it and just doesn't take it. And you're thinking, what the heck? Is it the wrong size? Is it the wrong color? Like, was there a little bit of a micro drag or something? Like, what is it that prevented me from doing that right? So you can worry too much about what went wrong rather than, dude, you did everything right. Let's just apply that same thing again. You don't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily have to change things sometimes. It's not a matter of, well, I'm going to switch this up because obviously this doesn't work. It's run the same program and you'll just get a different result.
Yep, exactly. And I was really happy to have that experience, but I was a little bummed. And my wife was like, "You shouldn't be bummed. Like you had, that encounter. You called that bullet. You knew that was an actual moose you were calling in, and you got super close. And she's like, you should, be proud of that and be happy with that and count that as a success." And I did. But again, it was that same thing. It's like, man, what happened? What went wrong? Why didn't it work out? But I was really happy to at least have that encounter and knowing, if I wasn't able to harvest a moose, at least I had got to have that opportunity and experience that again this season.
Hmm.
So,
All right. So what
um,
happened
so,
next?
so the next day, my dad was coming into town, and I knew I was super excited to have him there. And I told him, every night until the end of season, we're gonna be going and sitting on the ridge line. And so that night or that day, Saturday, went and picked up my dad in Anchorage. He landed. Ran a bunch of errands in town, but I'm like, we have to be back home so that we have enough time to go out and sit at night. And so we got home and I kind of had this like antsy feeling in the air and I was like getting stuff ready. I'm like, yeah, I have a really good feeling about tonight. We called a bowling last night where he's in the same area. As long as somebody hasn't come in there and screwed it up this during the weekend, I think we'll have a good opportunity. So ran the exact same program, parked the truck, hiked in, we just kind of slowly made our way in again, not trying to be quiet, not trying to be super loud, just trying to sound like a moose. And we get to the ridge line, we get right to where I've been sitting every single night. I take my pack off, I sit down. My dad's still standing up and he's still got his pack on. And I let out a cow call. And within 3 minutes of being there, I hear something walking. And one of the benefits of coming to this exact same spot every night is I've started to kind of make a pattern. And a lot of these moose that I'm hearing, whether it's the cow that I've seen or, critters that I've heard walking through the brush that I never got to see, they were always kind of to my right. And this ridge, there's a couple draws that kind of come down off of this ridge line that I'm sitting on. And it seems like those moose are using those draws to move back and forth between the swamp down below me and the higher ground above me. And so I could almost immediately once we sat down, I could hear something walking around kind of off to my right, a couple hundred yards away where I've consistently been hearing moose. So my dad sits down. I'm like, I think I hear something over there. I let out another cow call, and immediately I hear a moose snort. So I'm like, all right, well, I know we just sat down, but I gotta move. And so I start moving within 5 minutes upon getting there, leave my pack, take the paddle, and I start walking towards where I was hearing this moose walking around. And I get probably 40, 50 yards from my dad. I'm just letting out a few cow calls. I haven't hit the grunts and the raking yet. And I can just hear stuff moving around. Nothing's really happening quite yet. So I start grunting. I get to a good spot where I've got kind of a thicker spruce tree and some smaller willows and stuff next to me. So I'm kind of lightly starting to rake the willows, maybe rubbing up against the spruce tree a little bit. I'm stomping around, I'm breaking brush, I'm grunting, and almost immediately I think it's the same exact bull I heard the night before starts raking. And it's just, like a plywood, somebody's got like a plywood board and just up and down on a tree. And so I'm like, all right, I guess we're right back to where we were yesterday. the moose had moved maybe 500 to 700 yards to the south of where they had been. They moved out of the swamp and they're more up into that burn. So I'm like, all right, let's play. And I start grunting and raking and cow calling. And that bull is raking. I'm hearing a few grunts. I'm hearing him walking around. And the way that this ridge line is it kind of curves, it kind of goes south, and then it slowly starts to curve kind of the southeast, and then it wraps around around this burn. So I'm slowly kind of following the ridge line. I'm cow calling, I'm grunting, I'm raking, and I'm hearing this bull raking and grunting and walking around. And at one point, I was pretty certain I was hearing multiple moose moving around down in this burn because it just where the raking was coming from, but where the brush was breaking didn't sound in the same spot. And there were a few times where everything went quiet for 5 to 10 minutes at a time, and I'm like, is something happening? My wind was good the whole time. Are these moose, did they spook? And I get to a point where I'm kind of looking down where I should start seeing these moose, where I'm really hearing this bull raking. And all of a sudden I start hearing this cow just going off. Just like really loud cow calls. And I'm like, dang it. There's another hunter in here. Like it finally happened. Somebody walked in on me. I'm like, dang it. 'Cause I've never like really heard a live cow moose call. And I was like, dang it, somebody else is in here. And then I start hearing the raking, and I'm like, wow, that person is really close to that bull if that actually is a person. Maybe I've just been calling in a hunter rake in the last 2 days. Um, but this cow just started calling and calling, and like she would call for like 30 seconds straight. I'm like, okay, I've heard some bad moose callers, but I've never heard anybody like just make cow sounds for 30 seconds in a like just straight. So I'm like, this has to be a live cow. And it was right where the raking was coming from. And this cow would just call and call and call. And then you could definitely hear it was a moose because then she would start running and she's like, meow, 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 just like running around. And you could hear the brush breaking, and it would get quiet when she was facing away from me and loud when she was facing me. And I started putting the puzzle together, and this bull was on this hot cow. I'm sure it was the same cow that had been in that area I'd been hunting the whole time. He's chasing this cow around kind of in this burn, and she's just kind of holding him in one spot, and they're moving left, they're moving right, and I'm just kind of slowly moving in. And I switched from trying to be that sexy cow in a bull to now I'm trying to be an aggressive bull, like, hey, I hear you got a cow down there, so I'm going to move in and try to take your girl. And so I'm raking a lot louder and grunting a lot louder, and he's raking back at me, and I can tell he's kind of following that cow. And I get to a point where I can see out into this burn a little bit, and I can see moose moving left and right, back and forth, but all I'm seeing are like legs and bodies. And at one point, I do see a bull walking through the brush, and I just get this little tiny glimpse at him, and I just see like his right antler as he's moving through. And the first thing I'm like, all right, that doesn't look like a huge paddle. Just based off of like the half second I saw him, I don't think he's a legal bull. But I can't tell. I couldn't count brow tines, nothing. So I'm trying to get to the edge of this ridge and really look down. Can't see anything really well. And at this point, it's probably about 8 o'clock. So I'm like, all right, I got about an hour, 45 minutes until it gets too dark to see. So I'm really trying to get really aggressive, get this bull to come check me out. And this cow is just kind of holding them there, and she's still going off. And at one point, she finally does this really long, like she's just like pissed off cow call. And she like, I could tell she's running straight away from me. And after that, it got really quiet for probably 5 or 10 minutes. And I was like, dang it, like, another cool encounter, but something happened. This cow left and she took this bull with her. And so I'm sitting there. I'm just like, I'm not going to give up on it, but I'm kind of at this point, like, come to terms. It's probably not going to happen tonight. Bull's gone, and have the same thing as the night before. But I'm sitting there and I'm like, I think I can still hear moose moving around down there. And so I'm still grunting, I'm still raking, not hearing anything, not hearing anything. And eventually I start hearing a bull grunt. And so I'm like, okay, so there's definitely still a moose down there. Now I'm going to switch back from trying to sound like an aggressive bull because that cow is no longer with him, at least that it seemed. I don't want to be Mr. Steal Your Girl. Now I'm gonna be that sexy cow. Maybe another cow moved in here and all that. So now I'm slowly starting to work my way down the ridge and I drop down into the burn where these moose are at. And I'm letting out these super sexy cow calls, maybe a grunt here or there. And I'm getting down. And now this bull is getting really fired up. He's raking again. And this bull is grunting. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Like you could tell every step he's taking, he's grunting. And I'm getting this bull more and more fired up. And I'm dropping into this burn and it's starting to get dark. This is like 8:30. And I'm really having a hard time seeing through the brush. So I drop down and I'm looking out towards where I'm thinking this bull's calling. He's probably 100, 150 yards out, raking brush, grunting. I'm looking, and I kind of get up to where there's a big pile of down trees that fell in the burn. And I'm also thinking like, all right, if I call this bull in and he's not legal, and I call him in too close, I'm always a little concerned I'm going to get stomped by a moose out there because I'm sounding like another
Right.
bull, sound like another moose. He might see me and be like, there he is, boom, and come run me over. So I'm always thinking like I want to be around a tree, maybe have some brush to hide behind if something were to happen. And so I get to these next to these down trees and I'm looking out where this bull should be. And all of a sudden I see antler tips moving from my left to my right. And I'm like, whoa, that's not the bull that's obviously calling. And so I quickly hop up on this stump and I'm looking through my binoculars and I'm like just seeing movement through the brush and I'm like looking. I can't see anything. All I see is the hump of this moose and tips of a rack going from left to right and it's kind of wrapping around. And that bull is silent. He's not making any noise besides maybe walking through the brush. So I'm looking at this bull, trying to find where he's going, trying to get a good look at him. He's slowly starting to go for my left and wrapping around my right side. He was probably 40 yards out. The whole time, that big bull is still 100 plus yards in front of me, rake. It's coming straight at me. So I'm looking over here to my right, not seeing anything. I kind of turn my attention back to the herd bull, and all of a sudden I see a moose coming to my left, kind of at a diagonal, and from in front of me to my left. And I quickly, throw my binoculars up. I'm looking, like, oh, that must be the cow. I don't see a rack. And then I'm looking, I'm like, oh no, that bull, that's definitely a bull. And I first saw his right side, and it was just a small little paddle. I'm like, well, usually a paddle bull is not a legal bull. If he's a small paddle, he's going to be a sublegal. And so I'm just looking at him, and that moose slowly starts to move in. It hardly ever made a sound. Like if I hadn't been looking, I would have probably never even heard this moose walking. It was so silent. And it comes into my left and it stops broadside at probably 20 yards. And again, it's getting super dark. This is probably like 8:45. And I start looking this bull over and I'm like looking. I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird. He's got like this funky little drop coming off of his left side. And like, hey, the first thing I'm like, well, he probably must have had an injury or something. Because usually, antlers go up and out to the side. So I'm looking. I know he's definitely not legal on his right side, but to be legal under a spike or a fork, it only has to have that on at least one side. It doesn't matter what the other side is, as long as one side is a spike or a fork. And so this bull gets, behind a little bit of brush and it stands perfectly broadside to me at about 20 yards. Again, the whole time, herd bull is still coming straight at me, grunting and raking. The other bull is now gone from my left to my right and is coming behind me. So now I have three bulls almost 360 degrees around me. And so I'm looking at this bull and this moose is just acting kind of weird. Like he's directly downwind of me and he's just kind of like looking up the ridge line. I would grunt, I would like hit the paddle on the sticks, and this bull would just kind of slowly like turn his head and look at me. And then just kind of turn back and he just stood there. And I was like moving, like I was actually starting to, get more aggressive with my movements. I'm like, if I have to make something happen because it's getting too dark to see. So I'm moving around, trying to get around, get a good look at this bull. And I finally get just a good enough angle to look at his rack. I'm like, well, he looks like he might be a spike hanging off of his left side. And then he turned. I'm like, no, he's got at least 2 points. And this bull stood there long enough that I was actually like looking at him. I'm like, I can't tell. He gave me enough time. I pulled out my phone. I scrolled on my phone. I read Spike Fork like legality requirements, and I'm like, okay, 2 points on at least one side. Put the phone back in my pocket. Bull still just standing there. I look back up. I'm like, He turns, he gives me one good look where he turns his head just enough. I'm like, yeah, that's a fork. I only see two points on that left side. And again, this whole time that herd bull is coming right in. And at this point, he's within 40 yards every step. Whoa, whoa, whoa. And I could hear him. I can smell him. He's within range. And I look and I never see him. It's getting dark. This is pushing 9 o'clock now. And I'm like, I have what I think is a legal bull. I'm like 99.9% sure this bull is legal to my left. I can't see this herd bull. I could wait maybe 2 more minutes and this bull will be where I can see him, but who knows? He might only be 45 inches and have two brow tines. And I'm not
Hmm.
going to be able to count brows at this point because it's too dark. So I'm like, a bull in the hand is worth a bull in the bush, right? So
Right.
I look over and this bull is still standing broadside at 20 yards. And the thought goes through my head, you know, we need meat for the winter, but we do still have some meat in the freezer. So I don't need a big bowl to fill my freezer for this winter. This bull's obviously a yearling or a 2 year old. He's not as big a body. He's going to be a heck of a lot easier to pack back to the truck. He's standing broadside. He's still there. And so I make a move. I push up to a spruce tree right in front of me. Again, bull's behind me, big bull still coming in. I lean up against the spruce tree. That young bull sees the movement, whips his head over, looks at me, and I put my crosshairs right behind his chest or right behind his shoulder. It's getting dark. I can't see detail. I just kind of see, where his body is. I'm like, all right, this is about right. Breathe, breathe, pull, pull, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Boom! Rifle goes off. It's dark enough. I can see the muzzle flash. And it's like it was really funny. It was like that herd bull walking in was like mid grunt, and he's like, boom, goes off. Everything just goes quiet, and those moose just kind of like slink back in. That bull I shoot, he kind of jumps rears, runs ahead of me, and kind of makes a J hook away from me. And I could just kind of see his back as he runs through the brush. And he gets maybe 60 or so yards out, and he starts just starts kind of snorting and blowing. I'm like, well, that's probably a pretty good sign because I've shot critters before, and I've heard them trying to cough and figure it must have been a good long hit. And I'm like, I felt really good about my shot. A moose, even a young bull at 20 yards is a pretty dang big target. It's like
Right.
zoomed all the way in, and it had. I'm pretty confident in my shot. So right after it happened, I see my dad's headlamp coming down the ridge. He works over to me, asks me how I felt. I'm like, I'm pretty sure I shot this bull. And but first off, I was like, you heard all of that, right? And he's like, oh yeah, I heard all of it. And throughout this whole time, he never saw any of those, just thick enough. He could hear everything, but he couldn't see anything.
Wow.
So he gets to where I was. Again, at this point, it's like dark. Like I can't see anything. Well, I can see it like a little bit, but I can't see detail. So we get the headlamps out. His headlamp must have turned off in his pack because it's starting to die a little bit. And I got my headlamp. He's got his phone light, and we find a little bit of blood. And it was that photo that I sent you. I'm like,
Yeah.
this looks pretty good. It looks a decent amount of blood. It's not dark. I shoulder bladed a bull elk one time, and it was like that really dark, kind of that muscle blood.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, this is like pretty light colored. There's like looks like little pieces of tissue in there, maybe. Like I have a pretty good feeling this is a lung hit. It's not a gut hit. It's not a muscle hit. I'm pretty sure this is a good lung hit. And we followed it for maybe 30 yards, 40 yards, and we got to a point where he wasn't really bleeding. The blood that was coming out of his right side, and I shot him on his left. So that tells me I had a pass through, and it wasn't dripping on the ground. I was only finding it on the trees as he was kind of running by. It was like just kind of rubbing off on the leaves. So um, we made the decision to back out of there after we kind of were at last blood because we didn't want to push him. If he was still out there, I had heard him snorting, but I hadn't really heard him take off. So we kind of had a feeling he was bedded with that in that area. Dad's headlamp was dead. It was getting dark. I was like, it's cold. Dad made the decision. He's like, hey, let's back out of here. I'm like, yeah, I think that's a good idea. Backed out, went home, had everything ready in the morning. Had my buddy Kyle. I called him. I'm like, hey, let's be in here if you can. I'd love to have you come out and help me find this bull in the morning and pack him out. And he's like, absolutely, let's be there at first light. So went home, and I'm sure you've had this experience. Like if you've hit an animal and you leave it sit overnight and you don't know, it's a very stressful night's sleep. Like, did I hit the bull? Again, I'm like 99.9% sure this bull is legal, but there's like a little percentage. I'm like, what if this bull actually had like a point that I didn't see? And, again, I looked this bull over for like 10 minutes and ultimately I made the decision to pull the trigger. So there's just a little piece of me is like, what if?
Mhm.
And then what if he's still alive? What if I didn't hit him as good as I thought? I got like a couple hours of sleep. We get out there first thing in the morning. My wife, Emily, and I, and my dad, we get there. Kyle rolls up, and the four of us hike down to where we had last blood. I marked it on Onyx. I put out a piece of paracord. We get there, and all four of us get to where we had last blood. My dad and I kind of strike off, and we're just going to kind of start doing like this big fan. We're going to kind of sweep back and forth. He goes out to kind of where he thought the bull went, and he starts kind of moving from left to right, trying to, find something. I'm just doing these zigzags back and forth from where we had last blood, trying to find blood on a tree. And Kyle stayed back at last blood, and he was literally going every single leaf looking for blood. Let's just like picking it apart. And Emily at the same time, she's kind of hanging out. She's walking around looking for sign. And maybe within 5 minutes of getting to last blood, my dad does this big arc and he's like, got him. And we walked over, and from where my dad and I had turned around, that bull probably was just another 40 yards past us, but
Mhm.
it was so dark, you know,
Yeah.
even if we had found him I mean, we could have walked right by him that night and we would have never seen him. And from last blood, that bull probably went an extra 60 yards, and he was dead. Ended up being kind of a quartering to me shot. I tucked it behind the left shoulder blade, double lunged him, and it went out kind of at the back end of the rib cage. I don't think I ever hit guts, but it might have been like both lungs and liver. It was a little bit higher, so that's why he didn't really bleed very well. He was just blood all filled up in the cavity instead of coming out the sides. So got up there, I'm like, oh man, I hope it's legal. We get up there. Obviously, his right paddle sticking up. I'm like, okay, he's got a paddle and he's got like 3 points. So that right side's definitely not legal. He's laying on his antler on his left side. We flip him up. It's a perfect spike. Excuse me, a perfect forked horn. He's got 2 points. So at that point, stress is off. We have the bull down. We know for a fact, 100% legal. And we get up to him, and the first thing I'm like, oh, that is definitely not a ginormous moose, but that is absolutely perfect. I didn't want a huge bowl because we didn't need all that meat. And I know that a younger bull is going to taste really good. He wasn't super ready. And he's pretty stiff from staying out overnight, but it was cool enough. He was still good. So my dad and Kyle, Emily and I, we all get our knives out. We take a few photos, and then we start getting to work. Kyle came in about 7:30, and he's like, "Well, I got to be at brunch in Palmer by 11:30." So we got to work, and he was able to leave in time to take out a rear quarter, leave it at the truck while my dad, Emily, and I finished up, got this bull cut up, and the three of us each took two loads back and forth to the truck. It was only, a few hundred yards pack out, and we were completely done. And all the meat was back in the truck by about 12:30.
Nice.
So yeah, it was super cool experience. I'm really glad that my dad was able to be there, that Emily was able to be there to help pack it out, and that Kyle was able to be there. Kyle and I have been on a lot of hunts this in the last year. That moose hunt last year, our blacktail hunt. He had his Kodiak bear hunt, and then being able to be there and help me pack out my bow. It was really cool to share all those experiences with him. And then ultimately, once we got to the bull and we skinned out the head, we determined that that left antler, that fork, it's just barely hanging on by skin and hair. His skull is cracked. He's got this giant like hematoma right in the middle of his forehead, and that antler was actually squished over his left eye. And I think the reason that he couldn't see me that night that I shot him is because his eye was blocked off. And
Mm.
so every time he wanted to look at me, he had to turn his right eye all the way around to see what I was. So he was basically blind on the left side, giant hematoma, and then like either infection or brain matter was like coming out of his forehead. So I don't think this bull probably would have made it through the winter. I think he would have died of infection or something else would have got him. So ultimately, I'm really happy I was able to take that bull and put him out of whatever misery he was in. And then again, put really good meat in the freezer. Finally got that all done. Today's Thursday, so shot that bull Saturday night, packed him out Sunday, and I finally had that bull all cleaned up, everything in the freezer by Wednesday evening. So everything worked out really well. My family was there, friends were there, perfect size bull. Was able to put him out of whatever misery he had, and then again being able to do it close to home, and then just running that program, no going the same spot every night, patterning the moose, knowing there was a cow in there, and then basically using her as my decoy that ultimately lent and ended up bringing in several bulls, and then
Nice.
being able to happen.
What'd you end up shooting him with?
30-6. It's actually my
Okay.
dad's. He bought when he was like 15 or 16, a Remington 700 wood stock blued barrel. It's got the same Leopold scope that he had when he bought that gun. Last winter, I had a buddy of mine who does a lot of work with guns and reloading, and we floated the barrel. So we took everything apart, and he sanded down the wood stock so it wasn't touching the barrel. We put new scope rings on it, lifted it up. So we did a lot of work with the rifle to where it was shooting a little bit better. And yeah, it was really cool to be able to use my dad's old rifle and take that moose. And I was shooting a little bit different cartridge. I grew up shooting Remington Corlocks, I think, like everybody, and they're good rounds, but they don't necessarily they fragment, they mushroom really fast. I did shoot a bear one time, and it just like I didn't get hardly any penetration. The bullet just like exploded, and I was really looking for something with a little bit better penetration and a little bit more weight retention. So I started shooting those copper bullets, and I found that my rifle really likes the Hornady Outfitter shooting that 180 grain CX bullet.
Hmm.
And so I've shot a couple blacktail with that now, and then this moose, and I really really liked what it did. For this bowl, again, it didn't bleed a lot. The entrance hole was maybe like a little bit bigger than the size of a pencil, and then the exit hole was like maybe the size of a silver dollar. So it wasn't a super big wound channel, but it did explode both lungs, and both lungs were absolutely toast.
Hmm.
Um, and it was a complete pass through. I didn't hit a single bone. There was no bone fragments. I just like tucked it between two ribs on one side and between two ribs on the other side.
Nice.
Uh, so it didn't have any, fragmentation or anything. I'm pretty sure that bullet just went right through him. Um, but that was a concern because on one of the blacktails that I shot last year, I shot it head on, and when I got up to it, I'm like, man, I must have killed it with one of my previous shots, and I must have missed it with that last shot. But when I tilted him up, he had like a pencil hole through the base of his neck and a pencil hole out the back. So
Mm.
not a ton of expansion, but it punches all the way through and does enough work, I guess.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Hornady rounds. I know the Remington Core-Lokt, that's a name that's synonymous with deer hunting, but with Remington's issues with bankruptcy and whatnot, it seems like the quality has definitely deteriorated quite a bit. I had a whole bunch of I'd kind of bought those on sale when I first got this rifle, 15 or 20 years ago or so, and it just
Mhm.
keeps spraying. It just didn't seem to really congeal into a nice pattern. So a buddy of mine got me on the Hornadies and just great, great rounds. My wife and I were shooting the Precision Hunters, the ELDX,
Mhm.
and they're a little bit bigger. They're a 145 grain. And so we both got in rut, two deer that we shot just totally through it. Like there wasn't really that impact trauma. It was just through carnage on the inside, but it's both of the deers ran a little bit. We didn't didn't hit heart. More it was kind of a quartering shot, so we both kind of got lung and liver. But it just shot right through it. I mean, those are great rounds from far, especially, but
Mhm.
um, Yeah, it's the 30-06, great rifle. People talk about that one and the 270. And then as you get further, you get smaller and smaller. And Tyler Friel got that awesome bull this year with the 22 ARC. I don't know if it's ARC or ARC or how you pronounce that, but that's a pretty small, powerful round that if you're really experienced, it could be the round that replaces a 243. Um, but he shoots thousands and thousands of rounds per year. So
Yeah.
someone who's like, hey, I'm just looking for this new cool thing, and I'm going to buy this 22 ARC just because Tyler Friel did it, and then you try to do the same thing or have that same sort of precise shot placement, and it doesn't happen, then all of a sudden you're just emptying into this thing. So I think those are great and good practical for people who have a lot of experience, but the ordinary run-of-the-mill type person like the me is going to need something a little bit bigger caliber because I'm not aiming for the heart for sure, but always hitting it. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah. Well, I was pretty happy I didn't hit the heart because I like eating heart. So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
I'm glad I missed it.
yeah. That's another thing too. It's people down here they don't want to ruin the rib meat
Mhm.
or risk hitting a shoulder because there's not a whole lot of meat on the blacktails down here, so they'll go for the neck. And then I think,
Mhm.
well, there's more meat on the neck, and the neck roast is such a great, well, roast. The neck cut, the neck is a great roast. So by not wanting to ruin the shoulder potentially or ruin the ribs, you're losing a lot more meat by shooting it in the neck. But everybody has their things. But yeah, it's really tough to beat like some heart tacos
Yeah.
with some onions. It's pretty stinking good.
Yeah. Well, I still have heart from my last bowl, and I always like, hey, let's cook heart. My wife's like, yeah, I don't know. So I know she's not going to listen. Don't tell her, but I actually just chopped that heart up and I threw it in with a grind. So
No,
she'll
nice,
eat it eventually.
nice.
Uh,
Yeah, how long do you I've found that a couple days in milk kind of helps break down the heart a little bit. What do you do or do you just eat it like an apple?
I when I've done it before, I just slice it up and I just fry it on a stove. Like last year during our blacktail hunt, we were staying in the cabin, and that first night we had heart, and I just sliced it up in medallions and just fried it. That's usually how I just cook it like I would a steak.
Hmm. Yeah, I've done it both ways. I've done it fresh right off, just kind of scrape off any coagulation on there. But
Mhm.
then also letting it hang in some milk for a little bit. Um, Kind of tenderize it. But yeah, it's good no matter what. I think couple friends that they bread it a little bit, which if you bread anything, it's going to taste really good. But yeah, heart's kind of underrated, I guess.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the bull might not be able to survive the winter, and it's probably true, especially if you had a winter even close to what you guys had last year. I remember a couple pictures of a whole bunch of moose that were in the Fred Meyer parking lot in Wasilla or somewhere, just because that was the only place that was clear of snow. Um,
Mhm.
and some of those bad winters can knock off 15-20% of the populations. And those are all estimates, of course, and it's hard to make those estimates, but they do those flyovers and whatnot. But it seems like the population is pretty good in Alaska, but it's just being that they're not that huge herd animal, it just seems like a very unique hunt. Like you said, like you're going to a spot where other people could have driven to, and you happen to be the one that made it happen. So it's a unique experience for moose, but pretty awesome.
Yeah, I mean, populations this year, I feel like I've seen more cows with calves. I've seen more calf tracks, so I know that's going to be good for the next couple years. But like in units next to us, we've had, 2 years ago they gave out 150 any bull permits. Last year they gave out like 47 any bull permits, and then this year they didn't even offer an any bull season out there.
Wow.
So there's something that the biologist must be seeing out there, whether that's predation or lack of food or something's affecting those populations to the point that the biologists are like, hey, we got to get rid of this any bull tag because we're taking too many younger bulls. So yeah, we'll have to see what the next couple of years brings. But again, I feel like I've seen more cows and more cows with calves. So Yeah, it's all going to depend on what this winter looks like for sure.
Those surveys are really tough because it's obvious it's a massive state. And if you're flying over looking at a caribou herd, you can make a much better determination of the population and the health of the population. When you're dealing with animals that live in trees, if they don't have the paddles, it's going to be kind of hard to maybe um, pick out if it's a moose or if it's a tree, or especially if it's standing still. But they do the um, you have a huge expanse of land, and I guess they when they do their flyovers, they they divide the entire area that they're going to take the survey from into these 6 by 6 mile units, and they judge it based on habitat. So this would be should have a high concentration or high likelihood of finding a moose. This is going to be a lower one. And so they kind of take from each types of habitat, and then they do their flyovers, and then they extrapolate because they can't fly over all of the territory and count everything. So using that model, I'm not sure what the name of that thing is, but that extrapolation model is what they do for blacktails down here too, by flying over the alpine and based on how many blacktail deer they would expect to see. And then same thing with wolves. You're doing the wolf boards, but there's a level of human error just because it's impossible to get super accurate numbers. Sometimes people get a little upset with taking taking seasons or reducing numbers, but you have to do something. And it's not that they counted every single moose and are able to make a determination there's exactly this. It's well based on the model that we're trusting. We're going to
Yep.
have to make sure that we're doing the right thing here and err on the side of caution rather than just open it up and kill way too many.
Yeah, and I was actually reading a study last night for I think this was in the like early 2000s. They did a study in Unit 20A, so south of Fairbanks, and it was talking about how nutritional value affects antler growth. And the study was basically talking about how a part of it was talking about how, doing these aerial surveys, you're flying over, I don't know how far above the trees you are, but you can look down, and if there's just a little spike bull and he's got little tiny antlers, like if you look at him quick and you don't get a good view, you might label that as a cow versus a bull. And if they have, the part of that study was like, if they have less nutrition, they're not going to get as big as racks as soon. So you might mistake a 2-year-old bull as a 1-year-old bull or a 1-year-old bull as a cow because they don't have that antler growth. So
Mhm.
it is difficult, especially, like you said, when they're in swamps and they could be in thick brush. And yeah, it's not feasible to go over every square inch of a unit.
Yeah, it'd be kind of fun maybe to go along with one of those just to kind of look, but you
Mhm.
do have to get fairly close. And so if you're kind of into the nice cruising altitude, seeing everything from afar, but you're getting just above treetops, kind of a little bit dangerous there, but it'd be kind of cool to just see the science and see what goes behind it. And at this point, we have so much more information than we did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So, best practices put into play. So it's cool. It makes me hopeful for the future. When I look around, I think black-tailed deer population, pretty decent shape. Pressure is the thing that's most concerning. Um, Sheep dipped, you talk to people who really know what they're talking about. We're in a kind of a lull here. Hopefully it recovers and hopefully this isn't the shifting baseline. Like it's all downhill from here. Moose seem like it's pretty good. It just the access thing for moose. When I think of iconic moose hunt, I think of like the McGrath area, Kuskokwim, you know, fly out somewhere doing a float, but that's so stinking expensive. So being able to get a tag that's reasonable to access, and then of course finding the bull that can be the tough thing. I'm definitely not going to be gauging size. It's going to be counting brow tines, or hopefully, just like you get that sport, but spike fork is plenty good.
Yeah. And that was, that's my big thing is I was really bummed because I wasn't able to do a float hunt. I wasn't able to fly out. I'm like, a lot of times I think in my head like that is how I'm going to be successful is if the further out I go, the more likely I am to shoot something. But I see posts and I see four-wheelers driving down the park's highway all the time and boats and some of them have moose racks, but there's way more that don't have moose racks. And who knows how far those folks went out. Like maybe they went 20 miles out and they didn't see anything or they didn't see a legal bull. So I just kind of had to get into the mindset where I'm like, well, I can't go that far back. I don't have that many days in a row to put into a hunt, but I also can't shoot one on the couch. So I have to at least go out and try to make something happen. Even if it's not ideal, it's better than sitting on my couch in self-loathing, watching YouTube videos of other people shooting animals.
Yeah. I was looking at the stats from the general harvest ticket from 2023,
Mhm.
and there was 2,568 successful residents, 13,663 unsuccessful, and there were
Mhm.
10,975 that did not hunt,
Mhm.
which makes some sense because when I went out with my buddy Ryan on his caribou hunt, it was an area that was three brow tined and it was a registration tag. So I was like, well, I might as well get it because if we get his caribou and there happens to be a nice bull that's near the landing strip, I'm absolutely going to shoot it. It has to be very close to the landing strip. We're talking like 100 yards from the landing strip because we got caribou's the priority. But,
Yep.
being able to print off that registration makes it so nice. Or same thing with the harvest ticket. You just pick it up just in case. But a lot of people end up not using it. I think too, the idea of moose camp, just like deer camp down south, it's an experience. You don't have
Yep.
to go, you're not getting alpine deer, alpine sheep, all that where it's just a brutal experience. It's nice to be able to take a lot of extra stuff. It's nice to make the camp. And if you go out there and it ends up being a 7 day camp out and you're with your buddies and you're cooking steaks and you're having fun and you've got uh, heated wet wipes, just all those luxuries, like that's a great experience too. So I'm sure there's a percentage of the population who's just going out there on their moose hunt, moose camp, and if they don't get anything, cool. If they do, they're excited. But um, moose camp is unique for many reasons, and I'm really excited one day to make it happen. So, well, thanks, man, for being on here. Thanks for recapping that. It was nice to get two episodes. Sometimes if you try to squish in fly fishing and moose hunting, it's just too much. Those two separate episodes end up being way better.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate being able to share the story. And yeah, it was a super cool experience. And yeah, glad I was able to put some meat in the freezer. And one thing I've noticed since living up here, back home, being able to harvest an animal was something that was like awesome. Harvested my animal, had a cool hunt. It was really fun. I'm gonna eat on this a little bit throughout the next couple years, kind of spread this deer, spread this elk out, and just have it like special occasion once a week. But it's different up here when we live off of what we're harvesting. Like my wife was like, you have to kill a moose, and if we don't kill a moose, you have to go hunt blacktails somewhere because we need meat for the freezer. So it's a different type of pressure where it's like I have to put something in the freezer or we will not eat this winter or have to go buy something from the store. So harvesting that bull was like the wasn't so much, yeah, shot my moose, gonna post a picture, gonna put the thing up on the wall. It's like, no, I need to shoot something and put it in the freezer. So it's like I feel like I'm doing more of a I wouldn't say a job, but it's like it's definitely something that I have to do. It's not something that I can do for fun because I want to be a hunter. It's something that's like, no, I need to live off of this for the winter, so I have to make this happen. And then having that stress relief, putting that in the freezer, it feels so much better to know that that's done and that what we're gonna eat.
Yeah. We are a long way away from true subsistence living because the true subsistence living was at a time when there was a lot more animals and food to subsist off and a lot more primitive tools. So the fact that we have, you can go on X on your phone and shooting a high-powered rifle and using all of these modern efficiencies. So it's modern subsistence for sure. But yeah, it's great to be living closer to, and then you just become more aware of the environment, of the habitat, and how all those things play together. And so you become kind of an amateur ecologist, or you become much more aware of the habitat. And I think that's words like sustainability are words that some people might not like because it sounds like a greenie or environmentalist sort of thing. But if you're a hunter in Alaska, so many of us are environmentalists in the way of we got to make sure habitat's good, we got to make sure populations are good. So let's not just be so careless with the resources that we don't get to enjoy them in the future. And that's, technically environmentalist, but environmentalist is like that word is typically used as a negative because you think of like people who are at Starbucks that are laptop warriors talking about how the world is coming to an end and we need to be more conscious of the environment. It's like, well, yeah, we're out here kind of living it. We're doing everything we can to be conservationists, per proper use rather than just preservationists. But that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't want to say like technically where I'm living is I qualify under federal subsistence, but I'm not like if I really had to, I could drive to the store and buy something. So it's not like I'm gonna
Yeah,
starve. It's definitely good to be able to provide all that. And
yeah, yeah. You go to the store, get some chicken wings. Those are pretty nice sometimes.
every once in a while you gotta stop and get a smash burger.
Yeah, well, you can't hear, but yeah, you're on the
Gotcha.
road system, so you get some good stuff there. But thanks again for being on here, man. Really appreciate it. Enjoy the house this winter. I'm sure I'll be getting some stories and enjoy that moose for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks, man.